Welcome everybody from all over the world. Thanks for sending in where you are coming from today. Welcome, welcome. Today we are here with Hal Schmidt. Hi, Hal.
Hi, Nicole.
We're here for his presentation on enhancing your HDR workflow, both with Topaz Adjust and Topaz Detail, and we're super excited to have him back. If you're having any trouble with sound or your screen right now, you can usually just minimize your screen and pop it back up, and that will solve the screen issue, or log off and log back in, and that will usually solve the sound issue. Also, you can shut down anything on your system that is running Flash, any websites that might be running, so just shut down as much as you can, and usually that'll make it go a lot faster. All right, let me tell you a little bit about Hal, and then I'll hand it over to him. Okay, so Hal is the director and lead instructor of Light Photographic workshops out in Los Osos, California. He is an instructor of all levels of photography, Lightroom, and Photoshop, and his workshops and photo tours, which he does tons, they're recognized all around the world. So a lot of people enjoy those. Some amazing imagery come from those, and I'm jealous that he gets to go on them all the time. Let's see here. If you have any questions, a lot of you have already found the questions module on your GoToWebinar panel, but if you haven't, you can just type them in there. Myself and Ashley Robinson, our product manager, will be answering those as quickly as possible, and then Hal is going to be answering a few questions at the end of his presentation as well, so I'll ask for those at that time. All right, again, welcome, and Hal, I will go ahead and hand this over to you.
Okay. All right, I think we should be up now. Everybody's seeing my screen there. You're looking at just a little bit of Lightroom at first before we move into the main subject matter, looking at the Topaz interfaces and Photoshop. Nicole, thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to speak again with everyone concerning Topaz products and your workflow. We're going to look today at one of my favorite subjects, and that is HDR. The whole high dynamic range thing, I think, is awesome. It's not something that we're going to use all the time, but it's an excellent tool to have in your kit when the dynamic range of the scene exceeds our technology's capabilities. And unfortunately, with kind of our modern cameras, that happens quite often. And when we have that range of the scene, anywhere from 6 or more stops, we need to do something or make sacrifices. Now, I'm not a big sacrifice kind of guy, so I like to get it all when I can, and that's where HDR helps me out. The HDR process, we're not really going to go into that today. We're going to make a couple assumptions in that we have captured quality source images. We have sent them into some type of raw converter and then used one of the myriad programs out there that's either going to fuse images together or tone map them to give us some type of final product which is representative of a wider dynamic range than what the camera can capture on its own. Now, I've picked just a couple of sample images today, and I'll put one of them up there. And this is an interesting scene, I guess. It's at an old barn. You guys will see this here momentarily, but at an old barn, and it was a place where we have actually some pretty bright highlights and really dark shadows. And it was a place, as you can tell, full of junk, but it's something we thought might be interesting. In fact, this is one of my favorite places to shoot HDR, but it is a little bit of a challenge. Now, regardless of whether you're shooting those old junkyards, which are fairly popular with HDR shooters, or you happen to find yourself, oh, I don't know, let's see, I was bored in an airport for this one, waiting on a flight, and this is, for those that have been up to Alaska, this is the Anchorage airport as that one pops up. But no matter where you are, you're going to find some times where you want to capture the source material. For me, I tend to use Photomatix Pro as my conversion software of choice, or my tone mapping or fusion software of choice. And when I do that, I like to maintain as much tonal range as possible, as much detail as possible, and then use that as a baseline image to process it. So for me, the HDR workflow really begins when I have a tone mapped TIFF. So looking here at this airplane and control tower, this is just the beginning. One of the main, I'd say, or the most common errors within HDR is assuming that when something leaves your HDR program, it's a finished product. That is absolutely not the case. I mean, it might happen every now and again, but it's much more common where we're going to take a look at converting the image and then processing it elsewhere, whether it be Lightroom, Photoshop, with the Topaz plugins, or sometimes sending it back through your HDR conversion program for another run. One of the techniques that we found to be very effective in creating a good HDR is going to be combining multiple versions of the same series of images. When you look at HDR in general, I think we can broadly group it into one of two categories. And I'm going to use that same car image to show what those two categories are. And the first one of those, I'll just basically say it's a natural looking image. It's something that is realistic. Now, it's probably not photorealistic because we have this entire dynamic range, but it's a realistic interpretation of whatever scene it was we wanted to capture. And that really sets one bookend for your HDR processing. The other bookend is the one that a lot of people like to do. Quite honestly, a lot of photographers like to talk about this one in terms of not liking it at all. But the other bookend is something that is completely unrealistic. It's surreal, it's grungy, it's all these different terms that many folks have come up with to say, okay, this isn't exactly reality, but it's something that's pretty cool. Now these, I think, define what is possible within the HDR processing spectrum. We have realistic, and then we have surrealistic or grungy. Now, there are going to be times and places where both of these are going to work for you quite well, where you might want to have that realistic, natural image, and that's your finished product with a couple of small additions. On the opposite side, hey, if I want to go crazy, I'm going to go crazy and do a grungy, surrealistic kind of thing. Now, in my experience, most camera clubs don't like much of this. A lot of photographers don't like it when it's completely grungy, but a lot of viewers do, a lot of consumers do. So it's something you definitely want to have available because it's interesting. It pulls people into the scene because something is just a little bit different. Now, with those two bookends, you can sometimes get to, I think, a different and maybe better result when we combine the two. So I'll give you another image here, which is going to be the same scene, but it is a composite. It's when you take a realistic image and combine it with something that is super grungy, very surrealistic, then you're going to have some interesting results. It gives you the control to pick and choose which portions of each image do you want to use. So this here, a composite, really just the combination. And I'll bring all three images up at the same time here inside of Lightroom with the survey view. But a combination of each of the two images is going to give me the one I have on the bottom. And we can do that without any complicated masking, without really anything complicated at all. Now, this process used to be, I think, fairly challenging to do because I'd need to take those source files and process them once in my HDR software to give me the realistic. And then I'd go through that entire process again and end up with my grungy or surrealistic, and then I push them over to Photoshop and bring it together. My workflow used to be just that, and it worked, but it was a little bit slow in that I had to process twice through the HDR tone mapping. What I typically do these days is I change out, and instead of processing the second time for surrealism or grungy through HDR, for example, Photomatix Pro, I now do that step using Topaz Adjust or Topaz Detail. So I really only process a single time in my HDR software, and I go for the realistic or the natural looking image. Once I have that, we can push over to Photoshop or really implement however you want to do your plugin for Topaz. I always like to do it in Photoshop just because it gives me that pure power control, all the features and functionalities that will make the adjust or detail sing. But I tend to take the realistic image, send it over to Photoshop, and then via Topaz, I'm going to create my grungy version. I'm going to make it as surrealistic as possible, or as realistic as I want to. Once I have the two images, then we'll use some of Photoshop's magic to put the two together and hopefully get something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts kind of thing. So let's take a look at doing that. And one quick example before we do it, I'm going to take us back just to those basic cars, because I think there's one fundamental piece of knowledge that we have to get before we can really start doing this on a regular basis. So if we look at just the basic, normal, realistic, honestly somewhat boring shot of this car in a garage, okay, we can make a snapshot here. Yep, that's realistic. Now if we advance and take a look at the surrealistic interpretation, what is different about the one that is grungy? And when I look at the grungy image, I'm going to say that the first thing I see is that the grungy image tends to have more shape and form. It feels a little bit more 3D. All in all, it has lower contrast. And if I have to quantify exactly what that means, the grungy, the surrealistic image looks more illustrated. When we change contrast, and specifically the transition of contrast, over how many pixels is that transition spread, that's when we go from being illustrated, like we see here, to realistic, where it's just nice and normal. This is, I think, a little more easily demonstrated if we take a peek just into Photoshop. And I have a blank document here. And with a blank document, we're going to use the gradient tool to demonstrate exactly what's going on here. That's going to be the driving force behind everything that we're doing. So if I draw out a gradient, and I have that, pull it way out from one side to the other, and I'll make that transition from black to white. Now you're going to see that that transition is spread over every pixel within this small document. When this transition is gradual, we have a much more realistic image. This is representative of that natural or realistic HDR, where there is transition from one tone to another, one color to another, one object to another, but it is spread over some distance. On the surrealistic side, we could take that same gradient and make it happen, the transition from black to white, in a much, much faster method. And we're going from black to white over a very small period. And you can see here, this is abrupt, a transition from one tonality to the other. This is what we're doing when we're going to try and use Topaz Adjust and Topaz Detail to take our natural-looking HDR and push it up into something a little bit grungier. So I'm going to get rid of the transition there. And what I've done is, from Lightroom, I sent one of the images over to Photoshop. Now, you obviously don't have to do this via Lightroom. You can do it straight from Photoshop. You could use the bridge. However it is that you choose to get one of your images to your image optimization software. Send that over, and then we'll let this process start. So this is a simple 3-shot composite. It's an HDR that was tone mapped with Photomatics Pro. It is a fjord in Alaska. Those walls that are up about 2,500 to 3,000 feet. There's a small glacier up top, a little stream on the bottom. This was something that was a challenging dynamic range, being in the afternoon with the bright clouds and the deep shadows down here inside the foliage on the hills. So after I sent this through Photomatics Pro, I end up with this basic, underwhelming type of realistic look. Now there are some things we could do in a very simple manner to kick it up a notch, but if I'm going to kick it up, I'm really going to kick it up. The way I do that is I'm going to grab my background layer and duplicate it. You of course have a few different ways to do that. You could use a keyboard shortcut of Command-J on the Mac, Control-J on the Windows. That's going to give you a copy. You can drag it down to the bottom of the Layers panel. Whatever method you like, take that background and copy it. A good workflow tip I always like to use, especially as I get more and more complicated, is I will rename that new layer. I'm going to call this one Topaz because that's the filter I'm going to apply in order to make some of these adjustments. So our goal is to take this basic interpretation of the fjord wall, and we're going to kick it up from realistic to grungy using Topaz Adjust. So up to the filter menu, I'll come down to Topaz Labs, I'll hit Topaz Adjust, and we'll let the Topaz Adjust interface come up. And it's going to do some initial processing. You'll notice that within your Topaz, it's going to pop to the last settings. So the one that I had on here, you're going to see quite a big change. This is the Specify preset. This is one of the favorites of my buddy Rick Salmon. But we'll see that we can take even something like this and fold it back in to get some really nice, realistic, and popping results. Now, for those that aren't familiar with the interface, I want to give you the quick overview as we begin to move around this. Over on the left-hand side, I'm going to call that my presets area. And I have at the very top a preset thumbnail, which is going to be living, breathing. As I move over the list of presets down below it, I'm going to see in that thumbnail a quick interpretation of what I would get if I were to choose that specific preset. Now, a lot of presets come with the program. You can also save your own presets, something that I think you'll want to do as you start using this more and more for your HDR workflow. But we'll reference a few of these different presets just to get us started. Now, the center of the display, this is what I would consider the content area, which is going to show me the image itself. And I can see at the top I've got two tabs, either an original or preview. This gives me the toggle before and after. A simpler way to do that is just to put your mouse in the center of the display, any place you're looking at the image, and clicking that left mouse button or single mouse button, you will toggle back and forth between the before and after scenes. For me, that is the way to really evaluate effectively what changes we've made to an image. It's much simpler if I can go before, after, and I get that big pop from one to the other. I notice everything that's changed. If you try and do it in a very subtle manner as we're moving sliders back and forth, that gets a little bit challenging because our eyes can be fooled. So that's our content area in the middle. On the far right column, we have what I call a navigator box with a few buttons underneath it that allow me to zoom in at different levels to see specific details within the image. Because sometimes, if you think about it, I want to look at the whole image. Other times, I'm concerned about just one small detail within the scene. And that, for me, is more kind of a forest and a trees kind of thing. Sometimes you got to see the whole forest to make sure it works, but looking at the individual trees for certain details with tone, color, sharpness, all of that is extremely important. Down below the navigator section, we have 4 tabs which give us control over everything from exposure down through noise. And to put these, we could talk about each of these controls for an extremely long time. But the way I'd like you to think about them today is each of the controls is going to help us do one of two things. It's either going to push the image to be more realistic, where we take transitions, that is from one tone to another, one color to another, one object to another, and we stretch them out. We make it very gradual and realistic. The other thing that we could do with these controls is make it illustrative. We can push it to be grungy. So that's, as I move these sliders, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of math going on behind the scenes to modify the tone, the color, the contrast. But if we look at it in terms of, is it making something more realistic, or is it making something more illustrated or grungy, that's the way I like to approach each of these. So if we look just first at exposure to get familiar with what we have here, you'll see that you have a few different controls. And in general, if we look from adaptive exposure down through contrast, what we're going to see is as those sliders move to the left, everything is going to be a little lower contrast, transitions are gradual, and things look a bit more realistic. As we push everything over to the right, then we have more contrast, shorter transitions, things look more illustrated. Just to show that right now, I'm going to take my adaptive exposure, which controls how transitions happen from one tone to another, and I'm going to push that from 0.5 all the way now up to 1. And we're going to see that things get a little more contrasty and a little more detailed and surrealistic. If I want to push it even further, I could take my regions, which determines, okay, how many specific regions does Topaz Adjust divide the image into tonally, and then to those regions it would apply exposure transition or tonal transition. Taking regions all the way up, we'll see that things are going to get even more illustrative. Okay? The transitions have been made smaller. So we're getting grungier and grungier as I move these sliders to the right. If we took them back to the opposite side, you'd find that just the opposite would happen. Now contrast gets lowered if we go left, it raises if we go right. Brightness, same thing. This is mid-tone brightness. Where does the overall image go, up or down in tonal terms? highlights and shadows. We can break down our tonal control into what is brighter than the middle and what is darker than the middle. For the techniques that we're going to look at today, it's typically a better plan to take our shadows and move a little bit more light into the shadow. Typically, I like to keep the highlights about where they are because some of the techniques and tricks that we're going to use in Photoshop could, unfortunately, force us to lose a little bit of detail. Now, we'll come back and look at these just again in a moment. Our next tab down is the Details tab. And Details, if you think about it, it's really all about contrast once again. Details, when we modify contrast, we're not going to really change the sharpness or the shape and form of the image. That's locked into place. But if we modify contrast at a medium, a local, and a large level, we can trick our viewer into thinking that the image has more, I guess, sharpness and also more shape and form. Strength is detail enhancement. If I move it to the left, we're going to lose detail enhancement. Things should look softer, less shape and form. When I push strength to the right, we are going to increase that contrast enhancement. Things will appear to be sharper and also a little bit more 3D. The boost slider does something very similar, but it's for smaller details, things that are a little bit more subtle. Threshold before is very similar to the region slider that we talked about earlier in that it determines what is considered a detail. If I want less of the image considered details, I move left. Opposite, I'm going to go over to the right. Now my radius controls transition if you think about it. The wider this radius is, the more spread out the transition is going to be. The smaller the radius, the more illustrative feel I get. Sharpening is at very fine, or the sharpen control is at a very fine level. And if I push to the left of one, things will apparently soften a bit. As I push to the right, at a very local level, things get sharper. Now, the great thing about all of these sliders is that they are non-destructive, which means for me that you can play with them and there's no risk of playing. And there's some things in life where if you play, you might get hurt. This isn't one of those times. You can move these sliders around and go to the extremes. I give you full permission right now to move that adaptive exposure all the way from the left to the right and look at what happens to your image. That's the best way to learn what they really do. We could talk about the specifics, but just start moving the sliders and play around. Now, in addition to exposure and details, we do have the color controls down here in the lower right. And the color controls I find for a majority of my HDR workflow, I don't use that often. But if we think about them in our previous terms, adaptive saturation as well as regions, these are going to do the same things for color as we saw up for tone earlier. Saturation and saturation boost is going to change the intensity of color within the image, and hue is going to give us modification to the overall hue universally, typically to warm or cool the image. For a majority of what we're going to look at today, though, we're going to use the top two tabs, exposure and details. We've had an overview of them. They can be a little bit intimidating. So to keep it from being intimidating, let's move back over to the preset side. The presets that are provided in Topaz Adjust are very good, and they're going to give us the ability to make an image either a little softer or a little more contrasty, a little more shape and form. For as an example there, I'm going to click up to the preset of Simplify. And the Simplify preset is taking all of the tone and color within the image, and it is spreading it out. It's making the transitions more gradual. We can see that result. It looks a little bit softer. It looks a little bit more like a painting. Now, if I contrast that with something like, I don't know, let's go back to that Specify one that we started with. I select the Specify, and now you'll see that image is going to pop. We have taken our transitions for tone and color, and we've made them very, very gradual, very abrupt. This is a much more illustrated image, as opposed to a nice, smooth, flowing, painterly image as we might have seen with Simplify. Even if you never touch the control sliders on the far right side, and we just use presets, you're going to find that some of these are going to allow you to kick up your HDR really, really easily. A common one to use, if we look down near the bottom, there are two HDR presets, and this is the bottom on the left panel. I've got HDR Pop or HDR Sketch. Now HDR Sketch, as you might imagine, that's going to make something a little more illustrative. So I'm going to select HDR Sketch, let the program kick it, and see what we have. Yep, that definitely looks more illustrated. As you get more technically into the program, what's happening behind the scenes, take a look at your Exposure tab. Notice that the regions are all the way up to 50. That means that Topaz is forcing everything to be abrupt transitions throughout the entire image. But honestly, even if you never look at where the sliders are, the presets are going to get you to a great starting position. So with HDR Sketch selected, I'm going to hit OK, and we'll bring this back to Photoshop, and what we're going to find is that we have now a realistic version of this image and a grungy version of the image, just like we wanted to have originally. So with a grungy version and a realistic, we need to arrange our layers in Photoshop such that the grungy version is on top. So you always take the realistic version and put it down on the bottom. If for whatever, it'll happen like that automatically if you follow this workflow. If not, you may need to move that layer order around to end up with grungy on top of realistic. Now once I have that grungy on top of the realistic, you might say, you know what, I like that grungy image as it is, and I'm finished. If you want to mix the two though, then we're going to go to the next step, which is using layer blend modes. And the layer blend modes in Photoshop are going to allow us to take certain components of the surrealistic interpretation and apply them to the natural image below. Now, finding the layer blend modes that's at the top of the layers panel, you'll see a drop down and you have a whole bunch of different ones here. We could talk about the layer blend mode drop down for we could probably talk about it for weeks if we wanted to, but there are only a couple today that I want to highlight that I think you'll use on a regular basis to make things happen inside of your workflow. Now the first one I would just like to show you is the darken blend mode. And the darken blend mode is going to take only the darkest pixels from each of the layers. So if we look at the interpretation now that I've applied the darken blend mode, what you'll see is really the only thing that's changed is the sky. So if you have an image that maybe I need that sky to be kicked up a little bit, but I don't want to change anything else, and I don't want to have to worry about selecting or masking anything, then the darken blend mode gives me that auto mask capability when something like Topaz Adjust has given me a darker sky. Now in this case I probably wouldn't use it at full opacity because it is a pretty big transition from the natural looking rock up to a Topaz adjusted sky. But I could reduce the opacity and it's going to end up looking really, really nice without any type of masking. So that's the first blend mode I'd like you to consider when you want to start blending your HDR interpretations. The second is just the opposite of darken, and that is lighten. So if you scroll down a little bit more in that layer blend mode, you can click onto lighten, and we'll see that only those pixels that are lighter are going to be applied to the underlying realistic image. This is a time now we see what is the biggest thing that's changed. It has been the rock face itself, and there are some slight modifications to the water or to the sky, but in general it's really all about the rocks themselves. I like to have these two blend modes, and I'll oftentimes apply them if I need to take a sky darker or a subject a little bit brighter. The real money maker, what we found here at Light when working HDR, is if you have surrealistic sitting on top of natural, instead of going to both say the darken colors or the darken blend modes or the lightening blend modes, instead our next main group is the contrast blend modes. And these start with overlay and they end up with hard mix. The one that is most often used when creating HDR blends is soft light. And what soft light does is it takes color from both layers and blends the color. It tends to make things a little bit richer. And then it modifies tone based on, in this case, our topaz layer. If things are lighter, it makes the underlying a little bit lighter. If things are darker, it makes the underlying a little bit darker. What you find when you use the soft light blend mode, taking grungy on top of realistic, is that everything kicks up just a little bit. Now we can back that off even more if we'd like to by taking our layer opacity down, and if you give yourself the before and after once you've done that, you'll see that your image, and I'll go here's before, which is the pure natural realistic image. Clicking on the layer visibility icon of our Topaz Adjust layer, we see that everything kicks up just a little bit. We're not applying the full Topaz layer because that might be just a little too much. If we wanted the full Topaz layer, we would run the image through Adjust, take the result, and then move that on in the workflow. But here we're picking and choosing. We use Topaz to create a surrealistic interpretation of a natural HDR, and then we'll apply certain components of that to kick things up a notch. It is extremely effective. Not only does it give me a little bit of color boost without becoming overly saturated, it also adds shape and form without I guess, degrading contrast addition. That additional shape and form is the contrast that we built in as a result of our Topaz Adjust preset, and when it's blended subtly with the natural image, we have, I think, a much nicer interpretation. That's the basic concept behind what we would do here when you want to take realistic, Topaz created grungy, and then blend the two together. Since we have a basic look at that, I want to do this on a different image and take a look at a couple of options that you have and some problems that you may run into as you work this a little more often. For our next example of this,
Hey, Hal.
I'm going to go, yep.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to give you a time
No
check.
worries.
We're coming up on 2:35, so
okay.
Just a few more minutes, and then we'll get to question and answers. Is that okay?
Sounds good to me. Sounds good to me.
You have lots of great questions. So.
Okay, so I'm going to launch out this car, and I'm going to just kick it up into Photoshop, and we're going to do the exact same thing that we did before. So inside of Photoshop, I'm going to grab our car, and I'm going to duplicate that background, giving it a new name. I'm always going to do that because for me, I save master files that have all of these layers, and that way I know what I've done when I go back. If I find something I like, I know how to recreate it, or I can always go back and make changes. So to this Topaz layer, I'm going to launch Topaz Adjust, and I'm going to go to just, once again, the presets. You'll find that for a lot of what you do, you really don't need to move the sliders much. I love that. The simplicity of the preset gives me the surrealistic result that I need, and then I can take it and blend it back in. So we used before just that specify preset. I'm going to use that, actually we'd use the HDR sketch. For this one, I'm just going to use the basic specify. And if you find that you like most things and you want to change something, at any time you can modify that preset. And so I'm going to take the specify preset and just kick up the shadow tonality just a little bit. So now I can see deep down into my deep dark shadows and get all the other cool shape and form effects. Preset, slight modification, and accept what Topaz has given us. Now each of these things, you know, we could go in and create these presets using different Photoshop layers, but in my workflow, and you're probably similar, I don't have the time. That's the beauty of going in with a Topaz filter, and very rapidly I get to my surrealistic interpretation of the image. So looking what I have, basic realistic. So basic realistic image, and then I will put on top of that the surrealistic interpretation. A general start for the workflow as you're learning how to do this, and we can't possibly talk about everything here in 35 to 45 minutes, but a great starting point. Grungy on top of real, modify that layer blend mode from normal down to soft light, and start into your process. You'll see here that with the car, by taking a grungy interpretation, putting on top of the real, you're really starting to kick up that metal a little bit. You're adding some shape and form to the image and intensifying the metals. You'll find with metal, this does really nice, especially brushed metals. If you still want to get a little more detail in here, something that I might do is duplicate your Topaz layer, and I don't know, let's try lighten blend mode. So if I put one in as lighten, that gives me more detail into the shadows. The second copy there is soft light, which gives me the shape and form, the color amplification of my HDR, a beautiful point from which to progress even deeper into this whole technique. But with the simple ability of Topaz to give me that grungy interpretation, Photoshop drop-down blend mode changes, I got a great starting point. Once you're saying, you know what, I like the effect on the car but no place else, then we do some basic masking inside of Photoshop and it gets even better. There'll be times when you want to maybe take the image and run it through Topaz twice. Once to make it nice and soft for the sky, once to make it very grungy and detailed for things that aren't sky, and blend the two together. Nicole, do I have time for just one quick version of that?
Sure. Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes left, so we're good.
Okay. So just to hopefully fill your heads full of some ideas, I'm going to show another little thing that we like to do here, and that's make two copies of a background image and then run them through Topaz, one for everything nice and soft, one for everything super grungy. So we'll go back to the airport here in Anchorage. I was waiting to fly down from Anchorage to Petersburg, hopping on a yacht to go photograph whales, and saw a pretty cool scene. Here's the HDR. The first step I'll do is I'm going to take the background and copy it. I'm just going to call this Topaz Crazy, because I'm going to take this and run Adjust to get it very, very detailed and very grungy. So with the second layer, filter, I'm going to launch Topaz Adjust. And I'm going to pick as a preset the HDR sketch. That really takes everything and does grunge it up quite a bit. And I'm not even going to bother with the sliders because I like the effect that I'm getting here just from the presets. And hit OK. With the grungy on top of the real, I'll take my blend mode and push it down to soft light. And you know what? I like that result. In fact, I like that result everywhere except for the sky. Because I had pushed those details so much with Adjust, the sky looks a little bit grainy. So, we've got the power, we got the control. Let's go ahead and fix that. So what I'll do is take that background and copy it again. I'm going to give it a name of just Topaz Sky, assuming I can spell. And this specific run through Adjust is going to be strictly for the sky. So back up to my plugin, Topaz Adjust one more time. And if I'm looking for a nice smooth sky, at least one that I can blend in, I like that little Simplify preset off to the left. You also might find that the Portrait Smooth preset works pretty nicely for that as well. It is, I think, a little more aggressive, so we'll go with that one. Portrait Smooth, not touching any of the sliders, and I'll hit OK. So ultimately we have three layers. We have our background basic HDR. We have a layer that has been optimized and adjust for the sky. And then we have a layer that has been optimized and adjust for the plane, the interior, the building, everything else. Now that Topaz sky layer, I'm also going to take that and switch it over to soft light to give me some nice blending with what's underneath to keep it from becoming too painterly. But now that I have both of these, we just invoke a little mask. So I'll grab that mask inside of the layers panel. I have my gradient once again, and we'll take this out here and say, all right, I'm going to set up a gradient mask so that on my Topaz sky, only the sky component is revealed. Onto the Topaz crazy layer, I want to take that same mask. So Alt or Option key, then click and drag the mask up to the second layer, invert it, Control or Command I, and now we have a combination of three different, basically our HDR, two Topaz interpretations, each of them blended with blend modes, and a mask to give me something close to my final result. And just one time for the before and after, before we'll open this to questions, there is strictly the basic HDR in kind of a realistic look. And then once let's see, making sure everybody's seeing, here's just the basic, and then we'll kick it back up again after everything has been adjusted and blended with soft light. Just reading the question there, Nicole, I see someone asking about portraits. This does work for portraits as well. This was specific to HDR, but if you think about what we're doing, if I had, say, a portrait like this one here, and I wanted to maybe do a couple different things to the portrait. For example, I wanted to add a little bit of contrast, detail, shape, and form to the eyes, to the lips, to the hair, to the clothing. But at the same time, I would really want to soften the skin. I could do the exact same thing. Now, this is an HDR, but I send this to Photoshop, make a couple copies. I can go portrait smooth or simplify, blend it in for the skin. I could add some details, blend it in to kick up the eyes. There's all sorts of different things and variations. You know, one of my favorites, if you're a pinup kind of photographer and you're doing pinup things, this is one of the best ways to get a really cool pinup effect, especially on eyes, lips, and any kind of props. So although we started with HDR, the ability of Adjust to get us to a cool, grungy, or smooth position, and then Photoshop to blend is awesome. So I guess I'll stop there. I could talk about this all day, all week if you let me. But that's a basic workflow, some things you can do to take that HDR to the next level, play around with it. All of this it should be fun. If it's not fun, get a different hobby. But it's simple, it's fun, and you get some really cool results.
Absolutely. All right. Well, actually, Hal, if you don't mind, I'm going to make a couple announcements real quick, and then
Sure.
Would you mind sticking around for 10 more minutes for questions?
I've got all day.
Okay. We have a ton of people that are just loving this, and you've given them a lot of great information. So I have some really great questions, but first, I just want to go ahead and take this back from you.
Okay.
And then I'll give it back to you in just a sec.
Yeah, no worries.
So with that, again, I will send all of this information to you in your follow-up email. So if I don't answer your questions now, that's because it's coming at you in about an hour. But let me give it back over to you, Hal, and get some of these questions going. You should be seeing that here in just a second.
I am.
Okay, great.
and while you were chatting about that, I was just doing a little work on a portrait. So that's what people, when everything shows up, that's what they should see. Just enhancing taking the a quick Topaz Adjust. This is a portrait drama edition with a slight blend mode change. And I just wanted to amplify the eyes a little bit on this portrait. Of course, we'd add a mask to avoid it on the skin. And then we just go in and paint in that effect only the places you'd like it. And you can end up with some really, really intense eyes and lips and clothes and all sorts of things just with the simple use of Adjust or Detail. So what questions do you have, Nicole?
Okay, I'm starting from the beginning. We might not get to all the ones that are flowing in right now, but Kathy had a good question. Just she kept hearing the term tone mapping and tonal
Mm-hmm.
quality, and she was wondering if you could please elaborate that on just a little bit, kind of explain what they mean and what you mean by that.
Oh, sure. Tone mapping is a process that we use in high dynamic range. Well, the problem that we have is not only can our cameras not capture the dynamic range, and for those who maybe haven't done this, dynamic range is the difference between the darkest and the brightest area in an image. So when the tonal range exceeds 6 stops, in most cases the camera can't display it all. So we'll shoot multiple images to get good tonal data all the way across that range, from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights. So that's one problem, is that the camera can't do it. Now once we have all of these images, we run up and run our heads into the second problem, which is that none of our monitors can display all of these tones as well. So when we have inside of our HDR processing software, we have access to all of the possible tones for a scene. And tone is just how light or how dark something is going to be. When we tone map, we, via sliders and different controls, we tell the software what tone we want where. So in effect, we are mapping out different tones in the image so that we can see everything. And HDR is, to some degree, when viewed through most current monitors, it's an optical illusion, because those monitors can't display the full tonal range either, but when we tone map appropriately, we trick everybody into thinking that they can. So that's tone mapping. Tonal quality, for me, it's the same thing as what tone is something. Is it bright? Is it dark? Is it in the middle? So tone mapping is the process that we use when doing a true high dynamic range image, and tonal quality is just what tone we're looking at the time.
All right, thanks for explaining that.
Mm-hmm.
Theodore asks, as far as your HDR process, he wants a comparison of your thoughts on Photomatix versus CS5. Which do you prefer and why?
Okay. I'm a Photomatix Pro kind of guy, and I'll tell you, I use probably 4 or 5 different programs, but I always find myself going back to Photomatix Pro, especially with the update they put out about 2 weeks ago. If you haven't updated your Photomatix Pro in the last 2 weeks, you are missing out. It is spectacular. I use Photomatix Pro because I think it has the best anti-ghosting. It has the best single image replacement of certain areas, and it gives me the most control over contrast. And when I look at contrast control, it's all about the transitions. Can I transition slowly so it's nice and gradual, or can I make it very abrupt? I will say that I do use Photoshop CS5's HDR Pro every now and again. The time that I find it most beneficial is if I am working with a very specific tone of red, or a specific hue of red, that Photomatix has a couple small problems with reds, and Photoshop, I think, does a better job. But for me, I'll say 95–96% of the time I'm a Photomatix Pro guy, especially with that update in the last 2 weeks. It's a free update. Get it. Love it. It is the best anti-ghosting out there.
All right, thank you for that.
Yep.
As far as adjust and detail, I know you were going to get into that. Joanne asks, how many presets do you find yourself using? Do you save your own custom presets, or do you usually just use the default presets that are provided in the programs?
Yeah, that's a great question there. I don't find myself saving too many presets. I like the starting points that Topaz gave me. I'll usually start with something like, to answer the first question, how many presets do I typically use? Maybe 4 or 5. Portrait Smooth, Simplify, Specify, HDR Pop, HDR Sketch. Maybe it was 5. And I use that as a starting point. When I click the preset, I take a look at the image and say, okay, is it giving me everything that I need? If it's not, that's typically image specific, so then I will go over to the sliders and modify it slightly. The only time I typically save presets on a regular basis is if I am going to do a series of images that I may want to blend together sometime later. For example, if I'm doing an expanded depth of field kind of thing, if I'm doing a panorama, anything that I might be blending and need to batch process, then I'll create a preset just to make sure I know what I've done. But in most cases, I like the presets you've given us, and then I modify them slightly.
Okay, perfect. All right, a couple other questions about your host program. Does Aperture or Lightroom have the same layering capability that you're showing in Photoshop?
Well, I tell you, I'm not familiar with Aperture. Lightroom itself does not have that, and I'll be honest, I don't. Boy, this is the Top Gun. They always told you never answer like this, but I don't think that Aperture does.
It doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to go someplace else. Now, there are other options. What you can do from Aperture or Lightroom is whether you're going to Photoshop Elements, whether you're going to Photoshop proper, there's other third-party software out there such as Perfect Layers out right now that could give you access to layers. For most users, though, if you're looking to have this layer capability, I would push at a minimum to Photoshop Elements, which gives you all of these. The only limitation on the surface is 8-bit. You can trick it into 16-bit processing. But I would push from something like Aperture or Lightroom into Photoshop Elements, and then ultimately up into Photoshop.
All right, and that actually answered another of my questions. A couple people asked if the layering capability is available in Elements, and yes, it is.
It is.
Okay, so let's get into some specific questions for you. As far as when you're going through this process, do you find, or when you're in Adjust, do you use the noise reduction in Adjust, or do you use a separate noise reduction process like denoise or a different program?
You know, also a great question. When I do noise reduction, I use Topaz Denoise. I think it is spectacular. Nicole, I've got a great 25,000 ISO picture to demo this if you'd like. But for
By
me,
all means.
denoise is my preferred method of removing noise from an image. Now, with HDR, there are really two enemies to the HDR process. The first of those is noise, and the second is motion. So before we do any of that crunching together, merging to radiance and tone mapping, I like to take care of my noise reduction before then. And if I need to, I'll take those images and push them. I'll do a raw conversion, push them over to Photoshop, run denoise to remove as much noise as possible while maintaining detail and tone before I go into anything else. But the best bet still is if you're shooting HDR, as much as you possibly can, be near your native ISO and minimize noise within the capture of your source files. But I typically don't use the denoising features inside of Adjust because the denoise is so good.
Yes, and there's much more availability in denoise itself. I'm actually going to answer a quick question here.
If I could make one quick plug
sure.
there, Nicole. If you're using denoise, it's a great program, but to get the best benefit, it's really a 1-2 combo, and maybe we can do this on a different date, is a combo of denoise for a first pass across an image, and then you hit it with a little bit of Topaz detail right after that. So you end up with a basic image, a noise reduction, then a detail enhancement. It's a really great way to go for noise removal with detail retention. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's great. And that's kind of, I was actually going a little bit into detail. We have, I believe, your name is Katet. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. He says, when do you do the final sharpening? And I just wanted to let everybody know that Hal was here with us before, and he did an amazing webinar on output sharpening. And he goes over that in detail about using Topaz Detail for your output sharpening, and you can find that online. So I will just move past that question.
Yeah, that's a good one, though, because what we're talking about today is really content or creative sharpening. What we're using in the middle of the process on our would call it, I guess, our master file. Using Adjust and Detail, we create additional shape and form, and then we modify it with the soft light blend mode. So this is kind of that medium sharpening, and then the other webinar, that's for the output stuff. Perfect.
All right, great. I have a question from Raphael who says, I regularly shoot landscapes in urban photography and process them in HDR. Should I only get Adjust and Details from Topaz Labs, or should I need the whole collection for my workflow? That's a great question.
That's a good question. You know, for the if you're looking at HDR specifics, those are the two that I find myself using most often for HDR specific. If you are a landscape, nature photographer, wildlife kind of guy, I can't make a strong enough pitch for denoise as well. And you find yourself, geez, if I need detail, adjust, denoise, then I just jump into getting everything. Let me avail myself of the entire list. As a, so if I remember what's where, if you're as a landscape guy, as a street type photographer, architecture, if you take a look at lens effects, there's some really cool stuff in there. Clean and simplify are also quite nice, especially if you do people and you want to really make beautiful skin in a grungy landscape. So, you know, for me, HDR, I typically use Adjust and Detail, but I use almost everything because I shoot almost every subject, and every now and again you need to take noise out, you need to smooth skin, you need to kick up some detail. I like having every tool in my kit.
All right. Well, it looks like there are quite a few more questions, but I think we're going to let you go now.
Right.
So thank you again, Hal. I really appreciate it. Definitely would love to have you back. And tons of people have really enjoyed this. So thanks for the great information.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us. And definitely check out some of our upcoming webinars. And I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.